Imagine yourself walking through the streets of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD. The air is heavy with incense. Marble reflects the afternoon sun, and suddenly you notice something that makes your stomach tighten. The emperor himself, Nero, is passing through the forum, surrounded by guards and courtiers. At his side walks a breathtakingly beautiful young woman, draped in silk and jewels, presented to the public as his wife. But as they move forward, whispers ripple through the crowd. Everyone knows the truth. That figure beside the most powerful man on earth was once a boy named Sporus, and what Nero did to him would become one of the most disturbing examples of psychological domination and bodily violation preserved in historical record. This is not merely another story of Roman decadence or imperial excess. It is a study in how unchecked authority can twist grief into obsession, affection into possession, and a living human being into an object crafted to satisfy one man's shattered reality. The name Sporus may not be widely remembered, but once you learn what was done to him, it is impossible to forget. To understand how this nightmare began, we must first look at Nero himself. Contrary to later legend, he was not born a monster. When Nero ascended the throne at just 16 years old, many Romans believed they were witnessing the start of a golden age. He reduced taxes, sponsored public festivals, and delighted the masses by appearing in theatrical performances. For a time, his reign seemed generous, even progressive. Yet absolute power exerts a corrosive force. By the mid-60s AD, something inside the emperor had fractured. Perhaps it was the constant awareness that everyone around him coveted his position. Perhaps it was the isolation of being the single individual in an empire of 60 million who could never be contradicted, never challenged, never told no. Or perhaps the breaking point came with the loss of the one person Nero claimed to love above all others. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. She embodied everything Nero believed he desired. She was strikingly beautiful, intellectually sharp, and ambitious enough to share his dreams of eternal glory. But Poppaea was not simply another ornament of the imperial court. She possessed acute political instincts, making her both a powerful ally and a dangerous opponent. When Nero first encountered her, he was already married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor. That marriage had been cold and purely political. Poppaea was the complete opposite. Where Octavia was reserved and withdrawn, Poppaea was charismatic and commanding. Where Octavia avoided attention, Poppaea thrived in it. Their affair began as scandal, but quickly transformed into something far more volatile. Nero did not merely desire Poppaea, he became consumed by her. Ancient writers describe his behavior as increasingly unstable and possessive. He flew into rages if other men looked at her too long. Guards were assigned to her constantly, under the guise of protection, but in reality to monitor every interaction. Nero showered her with extravagant gifts that strained the imperial treasury. Jewels from distant India, silks from China, rare perfumes from Arabia. But more telling than the wealth was how Nero reshaped reality itself to feed his obsession. He divorced Octavia, a shocking act that cost him political support. Soon after, he announced his intention to marry Poppaea in a lavish imperial ceremony. The wedding was a spectacle beyond precedent. Nero spared nothing to demonstrate his devotion. Yet even marriage failed to satisfy his need for absolute possession.
Poppaea was gradually isolated from friends and family, surrounded by individuals whose status depended entirely on Nero's favor. Portraits and statues of her filled not only public spaces, but his private chambers, ensuring her image never left his sight. Ancient sources recount that Nero would sometimes spend hours simply watching Poppaea as she went about her daily routines. This was not romance, it was control. Love had curdled into ownership, and Poppaea had become less a partner than a living object crafted to satisfy one man's shattered reality. The name Sporus may not be widely remembered, but once you learn what was done to him, it is impossible to forget. What happened next would haunt Roman history for centuries.
Accounts of what occurred on that day in 65 AD differ slightly depending on the ancient source, but the result never changes. What began as a domestic disagreement spiraled into irreversible catastrophe. Some writers claim the argument started over Nero returning late from chariot races. Others suggest it centered on his obsession with public performances and neglect of imperial responsibilities. According to Tacitus, the confrontation intensified when Poppaea openly criticized Nero's priorities. She accused him of caring more for applause and admiration than for his duties as husband, father, and ruler. At the time, she was pregnant, carrying what would have been their second child. The strain of pregnancy may have made her less willing to tolerate Nero's increasingly unstable behavior. What followed has echoed through history as one of the most horrifying acts committed by a Roman emperor. In a violent outburst, Nero struck his pregnant wife with such force that she suffered catastrophic internal injuries. Some sources describe a single kick to her abdomen. Others speak of repeated blows that left her collapsed on the marble floor, bleeding and barely conscious. For a brief moment, the Emperor of Rome became simply a man confronted with the consequences of his own brutality. The woman he had idolized, controlled, and obsessed over was dying by his hand. The unborn child, a potential heir, was lost in the same instant. Ancient historians describe the aftermath as pitiful and terrifying. Nero threw himself over Poppaea's body, alternately begging her forgiveness and commanding her to live, as though imperial authority could override death itself. He summoned Rome's finest physicians, promising immense rewards if they saved her, and threatening unimaginable punishment if they failed. Nothing could be done. Poppaea Sabina died within hours. The unborn child died with her. At that moment, something inside Nero fractured beyond repair. What followed was not grief in any recognizable human sense, but a complete collapse of reality. His mourning bordered on madness. He refused to have Poppaea's body cremated, violating Roman custom. Instead, he ordered her embalmed and placed in a tomb more lavish than those of emperors before him. Nero declared Poppaea divine. He established a cult in her honor. He spent hours speaking to her preserved body as though she could still hear him. Members of the imperial court were forced to participate in this illusion. Her name was spoken in the present tense. Her seat at banquets remained empty but untouched. Any suggestion that the emperor should move on was met with exile or worse. The court now existed in a dangerous fantasy where truth itself had become treason. Nero's grief had hardened into obsession, and reality bent to accommodate it. It was during this unstable and terrifying period that Sporus entered the emperor's awareness. The boy himself had no idea that his life was about to end in all but name. Sporus was likely 14 or 15 years old.
Born into slavery within the imperial household, he had been freed while still young and educated for administrative service. This placed him in a relatively privileged position. Imperial freedmen often lived better than many free-born citizens, but that privilege came at a cost: absolute dependence. Everything Sporus had, his safety, his future, even his identity, rested entirely on imperial favor. And once that favor turned its gaze upon him, there would be no escape.
What drew Nero's attention to Sporus was not talent, intelligence, or ambition. It was his face. Multiple ancient writers note that the young freedman bore a striking resemblance to the dead Poppaea, especially in the eyes and the fine structure of his features. In a culture that believed physical likeness reflected deeper spiritual connections, this similarity would have seemed almost supernatural. When Nero saw Sporus after Poppaea's death, something shifted in his already fractured mind. Here was an impossible temptation, a chance to undo what could not be undone, to reclaim what he himself had destroyed. The resemblance was so unsettling that Nero may have briefly convinced himself he was seeing Poppaea return to him in another form. There was, of course, an obvious obstacle. Sporus was male. But by this point, Nero had declared a dead woman divine, spoken to a corpse, and ruled an empire as if he were a god. Altering a human body to suit his will did not strike him as an impossibility. It struck him as an inconvenience. What followed stands among the most calculated acts of cruelty in recorded history. Nero did not simply order Sporus to dress as a woman or play a role at court. He decided the transformation must be permanent. The emperor summoned physicians and commanded them to alter the young man's body through surgery so that he would appear feminine. This was not symbolic humiliation. It was irreversible mutilation. The procedure was excruciating, dangerous, and often fatal. Infection and blood loss claimed many victims of such operations. Even survival meant lifelong physical damage, permanent sterility, and total social erasure. Sporus would never be able to have children, never live as a man in Roman society, never reclaim his former identity. The operation was carried out within the imperial palace, in chambers prepared specifically for the purpose. Ancient surgical techniques were crude, relying on basic instruments and minimal anesthesia. Guards restrained Sporus while physicians worked, fully aware that refusal meant death. His screams carried no authority in a place where the emperor's will overruled even nature. When the ordeal ended, survival itself became another sentence. Recovery took weeks or months. Pain, fever, and infection were constant risks. But Nero did not see suffering. He saw progress. Once Sporus could walk again, Nero announced a decision that stunned even Rome's most hardened aristocrats. He would marry him. The boy was given a new name, Sabina, taken directly from the dead empress. He was moved into special quarters and placed under constant supervision. Seamstresses were ordered to create an entirely new wardrobe, gowns designed to conceal what remained of his former body and highlight the features Nero wished to see. Jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for him, many incorporating gems that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. These objects were not decoration. They were instruments of psychological domination. Every piece of jewelry, every garment was a reminder that Sporus no longer existed. He was being remade into someone else. Makeup artists instructed him in cosmetic techniques meant to soften his features. Dark pigments enlarged his eyes. Powders reshaped his face. Rouge colored his cheeks.
Hairdressers spent hours arranging his hair into elaborate styles fashionable among aristocratic Roman women, using heated tools and precious ornaments. Yet the most damaging lessons were not physical. Tutors trained him in feminine movement and behavior. He was taught how to walk, how to sit, how to arrange his clothing, how to gesture with grace rather than strength. Voice coaches worked relentlessly to alter his speech, pushing his voice into higher registers and forcing unfamiliar patterns of expression. Each lesson stripped away another layer of his original self. Every mirror reflected a stranger wearing his face. Every correction reminded him that survival depended on obedience. By the time preparations for the wedding began, Sporus had been transformed into a living performance, crafted not to exist, but to replace the dead.
The wedding was scheduled for the spring of 67 AD, deliberately timed to coincide with religious festivals that would lend the ceremony an air of sacred legitimacy. Nero spared no expense. He intended this union to be seen not as a grotesque novelty, but as a rightful imperial marriage worthy of Rome's highest authority. The ceremony took place in the grandest hall of the palace, its marble floors covered with imported flowers and illuminated by thousands of oil lamps. Musicians played traditional wedding hymns. Servants circulated with rare wines and delicacies reserved for the most solemn state occasions. To an uninformed observer, the scene might have appeared indistinguishable from any other imperial wedding, but those who understood what they were witnessing knew it was something profoundly unsettling. The most powerful man in the world was publicly marrying a surgically altered teenage boy, dressed and presented as the dead woman he had once loved and killed. Every ritual was observed, vows were exchanged, hands were joined, sacred bread was shared, legal documents were signed, formalizing the marriage under Roman law. The guests performed their roles flawlessly, offering congratulations and costly gifts, applauding at the appropriate moments, smiling with practiced precision. Beneath the surface, however, the atmosphere was thick with fear and disbelief. Participation was not optional. Doubt itself was dangerous. After the ceremony, Nero treated Sporus exactly as he would an empress. The young man was granted his own household staff, private chambers within the palace, and a steady income drawn directly from the imperial treasury. He was given a ceremonial litter for public appearances, horses for travel, and a retinue befitting his new status. Yet this luxury came at an unbearable cost. Sporus's original identity was not merely suppressed, it was erased. He was expected to appear constantly at Nero's side, to attend state dinners, public ceremonies, and private gatherings, performing the role of devoted wife without deviation. This was not theater. Nero genuinely appeared to believe that he had restored Poppaea to life. He addressed Sporus by the dead wife's name, spoke to him about shared memories that had never occurred, and expected responses that upheld the illusion. When Nero reminisced about moments from his former marriage, Sporus was required to react as though he remembered them himself. Every interaction became a test. Any hesitation, any inconsistency carried the risk of violent consequences. Over time, ancient writers note that Sporus became disturbingly adept at navigating Nero's shifting moods. He learned to anticipate emotional changes, to mirror expected reactions, to maintain the fragile fantasy upon which his survival depended. Publicly, he performed his role flawlessly. Privately, he grew increasingly withdrawn. Sources describe him as quiet,
melancholy and distant, even as he continued to meet every expectation placed upon him. The psychological toll was immense. Each morning, Sporus awoke in rooms designed to replicate those once occupied by a dead woman he had never known. Portraits of Poppaea surrounded him. Jewelry she had worn now adorned his body. Servants addressed him as Sabina. His reflection bore no resemblance to the person he once was. For more than 2 years, this unnatural existence continued, but the ordeal would intensify further when Nero decided to leave Rome altogether.
Nero's fascination with himself as an artist soon pulled the entire imperial court eastward. Convinced that Greek audiences would better appreciate his talents, the emperor announced an extended tour of Greece, where he intended to compete in musical, theatrical, and athletic festivals. It was an extravagant undertaking that drained resources and ignored growing unrest across the empire. Sporus, now publicly presented as the empress, accompanied him. To foreign dignitaries and city officials, Nero proudly displayed his wife, demanding the same reverence and protocol accorded to any Roman empress. Greek elites, already uneasy under Roman rule, were forced to participate in the fiction. They offered honors, staged celebrations, and spoke the required words, even as they privately struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. To the Greeks, trained in philosophy and keen observers of human behavior, the situation was both bewildering and disturbing. Their conqueror traveled with a teenage boy dressed as a woman, insisting this figure was his resurrected spouse. Yet resistance was impossible. Nero's power was absolute, and the cost of disbelief was ruin. While Nero sang, acted, and competed, always declared victorious regardless of performance, Sporus remained constantly at his side. He endured endless public appearances, elaborate ceremonies, and intimate scrutiny from foreign courts. The role he played in Rome had now become an international spectacle. But beneath the pageantry, the empire was unraveling. Governors grew resentful. Military commanders questioned Nero's fitness to rule. The Praetorian Guard, once fiercely loyal, began to waver. By 68 AD, rebellions erupted across multiple provinces, led by men who had grown tired of imperial neglect and humiliation. When the Senate finally declared Nero an enemy of the state, panic set in. The emperor fled Rome with a small group of loyalists. Sporus was among them. Even as his power collapsed, Nero refused to abandon the living embodiment of his fantasy. They took refuge in a villa outside the city, isolated and surrounded by uncertainty. Nero vacillated between grand escape schemes and theatrical contemplation of suicide. He rehearsed dramatic final speeches, lamented his artistic genius, and delayed action until the last possible moment. When news arrived that his enemies were closing in, Nero chose death rather than capture. Assisted by a freedman, he ended his life, leaving behind a shattered court, a destabilized empire, and a young man whose survival had depended entirely on his will. With Nero gone, Sporus found himself in a terrifying position. He was both a valuable symbol and a dangerous reminder of the previous regime. Those who now sought power viewed him not as a person, but as property, something to be claimed, displayed, or exploited. What followed would prove that Nero's death did not end Sporus's suffering. It merely changed its hands. After Nero's death, Sporus did not find freedom. Instead, he became a political object, passed from one powerful man to another as Rome convulsed through a year of chaos. The empire descended into what history would call the Year of the Four Emperors, and in that instability, Sporus's existence became both currency and spectacle. The first to claim him was Nymphidius Sabinus, a former ally of Nero who attempted to seize power by presenting himself as a legitimate successor. Sabinus kept Sporus dressed as a woman, publicly associating himself with the imagery of the previous regime, hoping to harness its residual authority. When Sabinus fell, Sporus was taken by Otho, who treated him in much the same way, less as a human being and more as a symbol of imperial continuity. Under each new master, Sporus's identity remained frozen. He was still called by Poppaea's name, still displayed, still expected to perform a role that had erased his past entirely. No one asked who he was or what he wanted. His value lay solely in what he represented to others. The final and most horrifying chapter came under the rule of Vitellius. Unlike his predecessors, Vitellius saw Sporus not as a symbol to be preserved, but as entertainment to be consumed. He planned to stage public spectacles in the arena, reenacting mythological scenes centered on humiliation and sexual violence. Sporus was to be forced into one of these performances before a roaring crowd. For Sporus, this marked the absolute limit of degradation. Years of physical alteration, psychological annihilation, and enforced performance had already stripped him of nearly everything. The arena promised something worse: public violation as entertainment for thousands. Faced with that future, Sporus made the only decision that was truly his own. Sometime in 69 AD, likely by poison, he ended his life. He was probably no more than 20 years old. In death, Sporus escaped the grotesque theater that had consumed him. His story lingered in Roman memory, but not as the tragedy of an individual. Ancient historians treated him primarily as a symbol of imperial decadence, a footnote to Nero's excesses rather than a victim of sustained abuse. What makes Sporus's story so haunting is not only the cruelty inflicted upon him, but the systematic destruction of his identity. From the moment Nero decided he resembled Poppaea, Sporus ceased to exist as a person. He became a surface upon which power projected fantasy, grief, and control. That Sporus chose death over further humiliation suggests that something of his original self survived beneath years of enforced transformation. His suicide was both tragedy and defiance, a final refusal to be used again. Almost nothing is known about who Sporus was before this nightmare began. His hopes, fears, and ambitions vanished the moment his resemblance to a dead woman sealed his fate. The boy forced to become an empress, the victim of absolute power, reclaimed in death the one thing denied him in life, the right to choose. His story endures not as a curiosity of ancient Rome, but as a reminder of the human cost behind imperial grandeur, of how easily individuals disappear when power is allowed to act without restraint.
Sporus did not live long enough to leave behind words of his own. Everything we know about him comes filtered through the writings of men who viewed emperors as the true subjects of history and everyone else as decoration or warning. In those accounts, Sporus appears less as a person and more as evidence, proof of how far Nero had fallen, how grotesque imperial excess had become. But when the spectacle is stripped away,
What remains is a profoundly human story. A young person born into dependence, raised without real autonomy, and ultimately consumed by the unchecked will of someone who possessed absolute power. Sporus's suffering was not accidental. It was enabled by a system that treated human beings as property, bodies as tools, and obedience as survival. Nero's relationship with Sporus was not love distorted by grief. It was ownership fueled by madness. Grief may have opened the door, but power made everything that followed possible. No law protected Sporus, no institution intervened, no voice carried enough authority to say no. The empire that ruled the known world could not or would not protect a single vulnerable life within its walls. That is what makes this story endure across 2,000 years. Not its shock value, nor its strangeness, but its clarity. It shows what happens when power is absolute and accountability non-existent, when a ruler's private fantasies are allowed to overwrite reality, and when survival depends entirely on submission. Sporus's final act, choosing death rather than further humiliation, was the only moment of agency left to him. It does not romanticize his suffering, nor does it redeem the cruelty he endured, but it reminds us that even under the heaviest weight of domination, the desire for selfhood can survive. History remembers Nero as a tyrant, an artist, a madman, a monster. Sporus is often remembered only as a footnote to that legend. Yet without Sporus, Nero's story is incomplete. The true measure of power is not how it commands armies or builds monuments, but how it treats those who cannot resist it. Behind the marble statues and imperial titles, behind the myths of Roman greatness, there existed individual lives erased in silence. Sporus was one of them, and remembering his story means refusing to let that silence have the final word.